All right, we're going to take a look today at Lamb of the Free by Andrew Remington Riera. This is going to be a little bit of an enthusiastic review, so get ready. But I'll take you through my typical format of the main idea of the book, the research behind it, the readability of its style, and then I'm going to add a little section this time called What I Learned. Which I'll talk about that when I get there. That's a little bit of an experiment or kind of a new addition to my review structure, but I think it's appropriate for this book. And then I'll end with just some thoughts on my reactions as a whole. But this is going to be a positive review. So, okay, Lamb of the Free. What is this book about? I was not familiar with this author before getting this copy, and I want to say thank you to Cascade, by the way, for sending me a copy of this for review. This is my honest reaction. I was not familiar with him. This was recommended by a pastor that I follow on social media, and so I requested it for review and was very intrigued by the concept, and that concept is this. Riera is arguing essentially very forcefully that the idea of substitutionary atonement and even more broadly than just penal substitutionary atonement, although that would fall under this as well, but even in general, just the whole thread of substitutionary atonement, that whole idea, he is arguing is not biblical at all, actually, and that is how clear he is and how strongly he argues it. And the way he does it, the way he approaches this argument is to say, and he does define substitution, and I guess I should say really quickly, if you're reading or if you're watching this and you don't know what I'm talking about, the idea of a sacrificial, a sacrifice being offered in place of the sacrificer, of the giver. So the idea that there is a sacrifice that's given that absorbs or receives some sort of punishment that then the giver of the sacrifice doesn't need to take it. That idea of substitution, like the sacrifice taking the place of the person giving the sacrifice, that's the idea he's taking on here, and he's arguing that has no actual biblical root. Now, if you grew up in any sort of, especially evangelical setting, that is going to be an extraordinarily provocative and head-turning argument right away. And so it takes a lot of work to really approach it, and he does approach it carefully, and here's how he does it. This is all still under the main idea. He very carefully and rigorously roots his argument in a slow and careful understanding of especially the Levitical sacrificial system in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And so a good chunk of this book, a good first half of it, I would say, is really a close and careful reading of Leviticus and the sacrificial system, and a breakdown of different categories of sacrifices and what is going on and what's the intent of each sacrifice and what is not the intent of each sacrifice. And also getting into holidays and festivals like Passover, particularly Passover and particularly the Day of Atonement, or as he calls it, the Day of Decontamination. He breaks down all of these rituals and rites and festivals and sacrificial practices as they are presented in Leviticus, and he argues very compellingly. He argues that none of them offer a substitutionary aspect, including Passover and the Passover lamb, which is really pretty shocking if you've grown up in a certain strand of theological or spiritual formation that really emphasizes the substitutionary aspect, particularly of Christ, and then would also argue that that is rooted in Old Testament sacrifices. He's really taking it's a radical argument in the sense that it's getting to the root, which is really what radical means. It's getting to the root of all of this way of thinking, and he's arguing that it's not there. And then in the second half of the book, he goes then to expound some of the implications of that when it comes to the New Testament. So he explores the Gospels, he explores the way the Gospels portray Christ as a Passover sacrifice, and not a substitutionary sacrifice. And then he does get into, you might be wondering if you're watching this, well, what about Hebrews? He gets really deep into Hebrews and argues, and particularly how Hebrews is doing sort of a theological, almost innovation or a really complex theological argument when it comes to connecting Christ's sacrifice to the Day of Atonement or Day of Decontamination, and what does that actually mean? And still, he argues it's still not substitutionary, especially in the popular way as we understand it. And then he does get into some like practical ministry discipleship a little bit at the end, some outworkings of what all this might mean. So yeah, the Lamb of the Free is essentially kind of a no-holds-barred argument against substitutionary atonement writ large. That's what it's about. And if you're in theological circles, if you've gone to seminary, if you just read a lot of theological works, if you're Protestant, if you're evangelical, I mean, this is going to challenge you deeply in a great way. So that's what it's about. Okay. Now the research, I'll try to go more quickly through these next two. The research behind this, so I mentioned that he does a lot of careful work in the Old Testament, particularly Leviticus, particularly in the sacrificial literature, the priestly kind of system of sacrifices. And so he really, I mean, there's a ton of Bible in here, so he does bring the receipts, so to speak, when he talks carefully about Leviticus. It's all there. He walks you through the text. But he's also drawing really prominently on people like Jacob Milgram, who is a name I've heard a lot. I've seen him referenced a lot. I hadn't actually read him. Jonathan Clowens, I think is how you say that, is another name. Matt Thiessen's another name that I'd seen a lot of that I hadn't actually read directly. So these are some of the primary researchers or interpreters he's drawing on, but there's a lot. I mean, this is a pretty academic book, so he's drawing on a lot of a wide range. He also does respond to people like Simon Gathercole, who's a very strong defender of substitutionary atonement theology. So he does respond to some people like that, especially in the back half of the book. But the first half is really, really built, especially on Milgram, but on some of those others, Thiessen and Clowens, and a lot of others. There's a lot of other academic work is cited, not only books, but also like academic publications and in journals and so on and so forth, peer-reviewed work. So yeah, very academic, very, very, I think he knows the radical nature of the argument he's making, and so he did a lot of heavy lifting when it comes to citing and, naming the sources and also just walking through the biblical text. So it's powerfully done, very well researched. And then the readability of it. So what I wanted to say about this aspect of the book is I ripped through this book, but I don't know that that's because of the style. It is academic. It threads a needle in my mind. It's very academic, and it's not dumbed down. It's not conversational in approach. It's not a popular level book by any means. I did not find it stuffy. I did not find it overly dense. I did not find it like ponderous at all. But I should also say that might be because of my personal interest, passion, energy around this topic. I've gone through a long journey in kind of deconstructing and reconstructing my understanding of atonement theology over the years. And so I have just like a deep, personal journey when it comes to understanding this topic and a desire to understand this topic. And so I found myself really, really going through this book at a high clip. But that might be because of some of that personal stuff. So someone who's not really that gripped by the whole topic, your mileage might vary with the readability of this one. I found it really readable, really like engaging, really had a high energy forward momentum to it. And it was some mix of because it is not overly dense and it's also like my personal kind of desire to learn about this particular topic. So take that for what it's worth. I find this is very much an academic book. This is not one I would hand to someone who's not much of a reader per se, or would not necessarily recommend it to them. But hopefully that gives you a sense of whether or not this would fit your reading style. Okay, so what I learned. Okay, I want to give a few thoughts. This is not something I've included in my past reviews, although I might do this more if this is a helpful thing for me to include. But I want to just name, because of the nature of this topic and because it is so like, provocative and head-turning, I want to name a couple of things I learned. And gosh, there is there's a lot. I learned a lot, particularly when it comes to the sacrificial system. So I learned a lot more about the categories of sacrifices. Particularly, he uses terms like well-being sacrifices, like sacrifices that were meant to just kind of commemorate a union and relationship with God, and they did not have any sort of like purging or cleansing or even like forgiveness aspect to them. There's a lot of sacrifices that were just for well-being. There's a lot of sacrifices that were meant to encourage God's presence, ongoing presence with the people in the temple. There's a lot of sacrifices that under that well-being that were just commemorating things God did. Passover is a big, big example of that. Commemorating things that God did and not necessarily functioning in any sort of like atoning or cleansing or purifying way. There's a ton of sacrifices that are just well-being sacrifices. I learned a lot more about that. On the flip side of that, I learned more about what the atoning and cleansing sacrifices were meant to do. So I really like that he also turns some familiar terminology to keep it fresh. So like he talks about the day of decontamination as opposed to the day of atonement. And I really liked that way of approaching it from a new angle. And he breaks down how the day of decontamination was to do just that. It was to decontaminate God's dwelling place in the temple. So that was extraordinarily helpful. And there's kind of a limited scope to what that was. That was not so much intended to cleanse the people. It was more intended to cleanse the place that God lived. And that's why the blood was applied in very specific ritualized ways to something like the altar. I also learned a lot about the conceptions of how the land gets contaminated by moral impurities. And how that was a major problem because the sacrificial system, he argues, was not intended to deal with the impurities that accrue in the land. And this has implications for the exile, right? If you know that the Israeli people were exiled in the Old Testament narrative, part of that was because the land built up too much impurities that the temple system was never meant to deal with. That was another helpful nuance. He argues the sacrificial system was never meant to deal with those impurities directly. They could only deal with decontaminating the place that God lived. But when the land builds up a certain amount of impurities from the moral, or rather immoral actions of the people living there, the land has to vomit the people out so it can heal and rest. That's such a different way to think about the exile than how I was taught to think about it. Also, on the notion of purity and impurity, he does an extraordinarily helpful job breaking down ritual purities and impurities versus moral purities and impurities. And there's a lot of ritual impurities that have to do with, like, for example, when a woman gives birth to a child, that's not a moral impurity, but she is still ritually impure and has to go through certain steps to become ritually pure again. And there's a lot of examples of that. Being near a dead body is not an immoral act, but it makes you impure in the sacrificial system. And so breaking down the notions of purity and impurity, and then that helps to understand what are the sacrifices actually meant to do when it comes to dealing with purities and impurities. And he argues that the big moral impurities like sexual immorality, murder, these things, the sacrificial system didn't have any way to deal with them. And so that actually frames a lot of the prophetic critiques of the temple system. They're not saying, they're not critiquing the system as it was given to them from God. They knew that it was a good system that God gave to them to help mitigate some of these purities and these issues. The prophets are more critiquing the people who continue to engage in these immoral acts that they know that the system has no way to deal with. And so there's a lament that's there that gets a different frame or different gloss when you understand that context. All right. So, man, and I could just go on and on. This is I'm just like riffing off of what I'm still internalizing and processing from this book, but it goes, and this is all just the first half of the book in breaking down the Old Testament Levitical sacrificial system and the priestly system. And there's a lot more about how applying blood to people could purify them ritually for certain roles, like a priestly role. But that's to bracket it off and differentiate it from that moral and immoral purity. And so what's needed as the system sets up and as the prophets talk about in the Old Testament, what's needed is how is God going to deal with these ongoing immoral actions, right? How is God going to deal with this ongoing immoral impurity that the people just carry with them? That sets up the coming of Christ in such a radically different way. And then you go into the Christ's actual ministry and how he dealt with purities and how he went to the not only ritually but also immorally impure, and actually instead of taking on their impurities, he actually purified everything he touched right down to the ultimate impurity of death, and actually purified that when he touched it. So gosh, I mean, yeah, I could gush and gush about everything I learned from this book, and there's still a lot more that I'm processing and internalizing from it, but notice everything I just talked through, if you listen to all that, not a whiff of a substitutionary aspect to any of it. And that's kind of his point, is that all of this stuff functions, the story functions, the system functions, understanding the ministry of Christ, and then even his death and his resurrection, it all functions. In his argument, it functions as it's the way that it's presented here, it functions biblically without any appeal to substitution at all, which is, again, it's wild, it's radical, it's an incredible paradigm explosion, particularly if you grew up in the context that I grew up in. So those are some of the things I learned from this. There's a lot more I could go into, and especially in the New Testament half. There's a lot of fascinating stuff about Hebrews and how does Hebrews build on this and connect Christ as a well-being Passover sacrifice to what's going on the day of decontamination when it comes to his occupying the heavenly realms right now, and making it possible for us to approach the throne, as Hebrews says, boldly, because it's decontaminated. Like, we can go there. Man, it's amazing. So, okay, I'm going to stop myself there before I continue to gush and ramble on that point. You've already gotten a sense. Here's my reaction. You've already gotten a sense of my reaction in the way that I've been talking about this. I adore this book. This is fairly early in 2024. It's mid-April as I record this. This is the best theological text I've read this year, easily. It's right at the top of the list for me, and I imagine it's going to be at the top of my like contenders for books of the year for sure in 2024. I can't imagine it. Unless this year holds an amazing, unprecedented, string of publications to come, I can't imagine this getting off of my list of best books to consider for the year. I mean, I think this is not just going to be best book of the year. I think this is going to be one of my top like theological texts I've read in a long time. Particularly I should nuance maybe biblical studies texts because it gets into that Levitical material so much. Although the implications for theological studies are also profound. I just really adored this book. I was blown away by it. I found it compulsively readable. My paradigms were pushed and stretched in so many ways that I was shocked by. I loved it. I think that this is an extraordinarily important book, particularly for evangelical Protestants to read and to wrestle with. I don't even know, I don't have enough I don't have enough to say any critiques of it. The only thing one thing I thought is that it would be really fascinating. And this is not a critique of the book. This is more just due to the scope of the book. I would love to see a survey, maybe kind of similar to what he did with the Levitical literature, the priestly literature. I'd love to see a survey of the first couple centuries of early church fathers. I know that stuff exists, but I'd love to see a survey of how the early church fathers understood some of these concepts, like how did Jesus' sacrifice connect to Passover and well-being versus like Day of Atonement, Day of Decontamination, all that. I'd love to see how the first couple centuries of theological writings dealt with that. That would be really interesting to kind of put in conversation with this work. But yeah, I don't have any critiques of this yet. I mean, I'm still processing and wrestling with it, but I am waiting with bated breath. I'm waiting to see how do people of more of the Reformed Gospel Coalition camp, how does someone like a Simon Gathercole, for example, how does someone deal with this book? Because this is so compelling and persuasively argued, and it has like rock solid biblical evidence. How is someone like that going to respond? I'm really waiting with I've actually been looking for reviews. I haven't been able to find any yet. I don't know if it's because it's so new. I'm waiting for responses because I think that, if nothing else, this is going to provoke extremely fruitful and extremely clarifying and extremely important conversations when it comes to understanding rightly the theology of Jesus as a sacrifice and how does the Bible present it. And then I didn't even get into what are the ministry and discipleship implications of that, but the idea, for example, that if you get rid of substitution from this whole paradigm and this whole mindset, then you start incorporating things like participation instead of substitution. Like, it's not that Christ did something so that I can be disconnected and don't have to go through it, but it's more that Christ did something first and opened up something that now I get to participate in him with. That grounds the reality of suffering and encounters with death in our world in a completely different way. And it's that he went ahead. He did it first. He went ahead. It's still singularly and unique in salvation and cosmic history. It's not something that anyone else can replicate. But it is not something that we get to opt out of as followers. We follow him in the death that he died and the resurrection that he lived, as the New Testament says. So, yeah, I knew this was going to be a gushy, rambly review, but sometimes that's appropriate when a book merits it, and this book 100% does. The Lamb of the Free by Andrew Riera. Outstanding, superb theological book. So far, book of the year for me. Likely to be up at least in contender for that moving forward. One of the greatest theological biblical studies books I've read in a long time. Cannot recommend it highly enough. Absolutely cannot, particularly if you're in ministry, if you're in theological work. Get this book, read it, wrestle with it, deal with the argument, let it sharpen you, let it push you, and let it maybe push you into a kind of a reconstructed theology that might take you in some surprising directions. So, okay, I'll stop myself there. But those are my thoughts on this outstanding book from Cascade. Thanks again to Cascade for sending me a copy for review, and thanks to you for taking some time to watch.